Good evening, everybody. How are you tonight? Welcome. Welcome to our virtual program this evening at the Mark Twain House Museum. My name is Rebecca Floyd, and I'm the Director of Interpretation at the Mark Twain House Museum. And that means I oversee the guided tours that go on at the Mark Twain House. And just if you weren't sure about it, the Mark Twain House is now open 7 days a week, and you can come live in person and see where Mark Twain lived, wrote, and raised a family. So please come and see us when you get a chance, if you're ever in the Hartford area. So, and welcome to this evening's program. Tonight, we are welcoming Deborah Cohen, and our moderator for tonight is Chris Tomlinson, for a discussion of Cohen's new book, Last Call at Hotel Imperial. I'll introduce them with a little more detail in just a few moments, but I would like to tell you a little bit about our sponsors for our virtual programs. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord. He was a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away last year. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all of our virtual programs. One of the benefits of this program being virtual is that the audience, you've already started participating in the chat along the right-hand side of the screen. You're telling us where you're from, and you can continue to participate in that chat throughout this evening. But we would ask you that if you have a question for one of our guests, that you type it in the Ask a Question segment that is just down there in the lower part of your screen. Then you can also vote up those questions as we go along. And while we're on the topic, that down at the bottom of your screen, there is a green bar that says your support is vital. Click here to donate to the Mark Twain House and Museum. So while we're grateful for the support that we do receive, if you are enjoying tonight's program, we invite you to click that link and feel free to offer your support so that we can continue to offer them and offer more of them if you wish to see them. Also, we will be posting in the chat the book, to post the book, The Last Call at Hotel Imperial, where you can purchase it from the Mark Twain House Museum store. If you purchase it through us and through the Mark Twain House and Museum, not only do you get a signed copy of that book, but you'll also be supporting the Mark Twain House and Museum through that purchase, and we appreciate that very much. So without further ado, let's talk about our guest this evening. So our moderator, Chris Tomlinson, is the business columnist for the Houston Chronicle, focusing on energy, business, and policy. Until April 2014, he was the supervisory correspondent for the Associated Press in Austin, responsible for state government and political reporting in Texas. He has a long history as an international investigative reporter with the Associated Press, reporting from over 14 countries, including Kenya, South Africa, and Rwanda. Early in his career, he served as an embedded war correspondent, reporting from Afghanistan, Iraq, and also reported on conflicts in Uganda, Burundi, Congo, Sudan, and Somalia. Our special guest author tonight is Deborah Cohen, who's here to talk about, with Chris, Last Call at Hotel Imperial. Deborah Cohen teaches modern European history at Northwestern, where she holds the Richard W. Leopold Chair. And Last Call at Hotel Imperial is her fourth book. She writes for The Atlantic on subjects that range from punk rock to Winston Churchill's bad debts. So please, everyone, please give a warm welcome to Deborah Cohen and Chris Tomlinson as we bring them up on screen. I'm going to sit back and enjoy this conversation, and we'll come back at the end to help negotiate through any questions and answers with our audience that you may have. And please do use that Ask a Question feature. And Chris and Deborah will let me know when they're ready to receive some questions from the audience. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm very excited to be back with the Mark Twain House. And I'm very excited to talk about, one of something I did for 20 years of my career, the art and tragedy of being a foreign correspondent, a war correspondent, and trying to explain the rest of the world to Americans, and hoping that they're paying attention and care about it. I confess, before I read Deborah's book, Last Call at the at the Hotel Imperial, the reporters who took on a world at war. I really shouldn't read this in mirror image. I didn't know the rich history. I knew the names, but I didn't know the stories. And so we're going to give you a little taste of the book tonight and talk about some, two of my favorite subjects, or three of my favorite subjects: death, war, and sex. So, Deborah, let's just start. What was the Hotel Imperial?
So just to say thank you so much, Chris, for being the interlocutor, and thanks so much, Alice and Rebecca and the Mark Twain House and the audience who have joined us. It's really a pleasure to be here. So the Hotel Imperial is still a fancy hotel on the Ringstrasse in Vienna. And during the 1920s and 30s, it was also a reporter's hangout. So it was the place where reporters generally went in the morning to gather up the latest news. They entertained tipsters there who came by with information about the gossip from, the Bulgarian court, or the latest news on the streets about putsches and revolutions. And it was the kind of place that was, as people said about it at the time, there was a kind of aroma of conspiracy about it. So when you went there, you always felt that you were just on the verge of something happening.
And this is still the tradition today. Every country has its journalist hotel, whether it's the Novotel in Bujumbura or the Milcolin in Kigali. And it's kind of heartening to know that it's always been that way. One of the things that really amazed me about this book was just the level of personal detail, the intimate details of these people's lives. So before we start talking about these people, let me ask you about your research. How did you find out about all these affairs and the double crossing and the petty jealousies?
So these were reporters. So the book is about a group of reporters who become the most influential and important reporters of their day, Americans reporting from Europe and from Asia. And they're a group of friends, and they're also rivals, and they're intertwined in each other's lives. So because they were reporters, they really kept notes. They wrote everything down. And they also had the sense as well that though they were tremendously important in their own moment, that their place in posterity would only be safeguarded by their archives, I think. And so I began this project actually because I walked into the University of Chicago Special Collections, the archives of John Gunther, who is one of the figures in this book, a central figure in the book. And it turned out that there, in addition to the 125 boxes of archives that were actually listed on the computer catalog, there were another 125 some odd boxes that were not in those records. And those were diaries and correspondence and, hundreds of thousands of small colored pieces of paper with notes about dreams and about what it was like to interview Stalin. And it was, for a historian, of course, who is interested both in geopolitics and in private life, these were people who were putting those two stories together. So they were, a post-Freudian generation who were interested in the ways in which personal life, intimate life, and the world of the dictators and the world of colonial nationalists intersected. So I'm thinking that we'll get more into kind of how they're making those linkages, but that's how I got into it. And, then I ran around the world basically trying to find, not only their voluminous archives, but traces of them wherever I could, in the Austrian police records or in British spies records or in Delhi or, wherever I could find them, which was a lot of places. But these were multivocal archives. So you really had the sense, as I said, when I started writing the book, you could feel them talking to each other. And so I wanted you as the reader to actually feel like you're sitting there in the middle of these conversations where no one knows what's going to happen next.
I mean, you do such a great job because it reads more like a novel than, I mean, in journalists, we always talk about finding those telling details because, it's the details that really make a story sing. And so, I guess it was some of the love letters or the letters to each other, the correspondence to each other. They really just kind of rounded out this story, and I'm just amazed that they survived as well as they did.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things. One of them is that this is a group of people who are born at the turn of the 20th century. So they kind of they grow up with an idea about rationality, and then they meet psychoanalysis and they understand they're psychoanalyzed. Everyone's psychoanalyzed, everyone's talking about psychoanalysis. So they understand intellectually that there's an irrational, that human behavior actually can't be explained only through the rational. And the collision of those two things, both the understanding that there's an irrational that you have to get to the bottom of, but then also still holding on to the idea that there's some basic kind of rationality, produces these, voluminous archives, because they write diaries and diaries and diaries and letters and letters and letters, trying to get to the bottom of what it is that they're seeing, what explains it, how it's actually redounding in their own personal lives. And as you say, a lot of wreckage, the wreckage of being there, being a witness, being a participant. And it's that they're trying to get at.
So let's start with the characters. And I want to start with Dorothy Thompson. I have to confess to everyone, I'm one of those old-fashioned reporters that still uses a old-fashioned notebook I can stick in my back pocket. So Dorothy Thompson, she's a feminist, but in other ways, very conservative. She has a complicated personal life. And, I have to say, she's probably the one I knew the least about, but she seemed to have had enormous influence in her era.
That's right. So, absolutely. So Dorothy Thompson amasses a string of firsts. So she's the first American woman to lead a major overseas news bureau. That's the Philadelphia Public Ledger's bureau in Berlin. She is the first American correspondent to be kicked out of Nazi Germany, which happens to her in 1934. It's a huge front page news story. She's also the first woman to have an op-ed column of her own, which she has in the late 30s. And she's speaking to an audience that's estimated at 8 to 10 million thrice weekly. So this just begins to give you a sense of her huge, huge influence. So Dorothy Thompson spends her young womanhood in the suffrage movement. She then moves into public relations, and she decides that she's going to go to Europe and see the world. She thinks, first of all, she's going to go to Russia and then later to the Soviet Union. And she ends up as a stringer. She kind of calls herself a journalist, even though she's never done, anything that we would recognize as journalism, and pops up in Europe, has a string of scoops, including when one of the many failed attempts of the Habsburgs to come back to power, who was there, but Dorothy Thompson with her reporter's notebook, dressed in a nurse's uniform, and she stows over and gets access to the deposed emperor and his and the empress and all of their plotters. So she is she speaks to everyone. She knows everyone from Freud she meets Trotsky. She interviews Hitler in 1931. I mean, just a mammothly important figure. And as you say, her politics are interesting. She's much more enamored, actually, of the Viennese socialists in the 1920s when she first goes there. She later becomes quite a conservative figure, or what John Gunther calls her, a liberal conservative, meaning that she has basic liberal ideas about the dignity and the importance of the individual, which means that she's extremely taken aback and worried about, for instance, FDR's New Deal. She's also a vehement anti-fascist. So, and a sworn
and
enemy.
an anti-communist later.
Absolutely. Yes. In her young womanhood, as I say, in her 20s, she's more sympathetic to socialism of the Viennese variety, meaning, public housing, milk for mothers and babies, that kind of thing. But essentially, she views her main task as the defense of the individual against mass society. And whether that mass society is coming from the right, like fascism, or from the left, communism, both of them, she's appalled by.
And she marries one of the most well-known writers of that time, Sinclair Lewis.
Right. In 1928, that's her second husband, and they proceed to have a fractious, pretty much disastrous marriage, where Sinclair Lewis, who goes on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, he's the first American to do so, but he's obsessed by his wife's fame, even though he's an equally famous person. And he can't get over it. He is always railing about how people are calling him Mr. Dorothy Thompson. And, it's a disaster.
Folks, you're going to detect a theme here, because the spouses are as much a part of this story as the correspondents. John Gunther, becomes one of the most popular correspondents in terms of, people reading his books and reading his work. He's, not exactly, considered the highest, the most intellectual of the foreign correspondents. And he describes his colleagues as scavengers, buzzards out to get the news, which seems very accurate to me. But he was also a complicated man. And as you said, it was his archive you stumbled on first, and actually has some of the most revealing and intimate details. I'll let you share what you're comfortable saying out loud. So
John Gunther is the best-selling American writer on the American bestseller lists from the mid-30s through the 50s. And there's only one person who actually has more bestsellers than John Gunther from the mid-30s through the 1950s, and that's the romance novelist Daphne du Maurier, the author of Rebecca, among others. So he's hugely, hugely popular. He makes his name, first of all, with his book Inside Europe, which is a behind-the-scenes account of the personal lives and foibles of the European dictators. I mean, European politicians more generally, but the dictators. He then goes on to publish a whole string of continent-wide surveys, the inside set of books, so Inside Asia, Inside South America, inside Latin America. Yeah, exactly. And then eventually Inside USA as well. And then he also publishes a taboo-breaking book, which is his 1949 Death Be Not Proud, which I'm guessing is probably the book that most people have read now. It was assigned reading. It was mandatory reading in many American school systems from the early 60s through the 80s. And that was his book about the death of his 17-year-old son from a brain tumor. So John Gunther's first wife was a woman named Frances Feynman Gunther, who was herself a sometimes foreign correspondent. And they had, as Chris said, this is a book that's as much, in a way, about marriage and about private life and about the relationship between private life and public affairs as this group of of Americans came to feel that those were really the important connections to be making for their readers. Frances Feynman Gunther felt that she gave her husband all of his best ideas. She herself, though a writer, had an epic case of writer's block. She was an extremely difficult and complex, very intelligent woman. But while he could do all the thinking, she could do all the thinking and he could do the writing. And as anyone who is married to a writer, or as anyone who's in a writer like couple knows, that is a recipe for a very, very complicated set of dealings. Now together, and this is the really important part, together the Gunthers came to kind of marrying a sort of Freudianism as well as their own observations. They came to interrogate the relationship between inner life and geopolitics. So what they became interested in is what makes a man like Hitler? What makes a country become National Socialist? Why is it that people want to follow authoritarians? And those became the questions that really interested them, but they found them in a way boomeranging back on their own lives. And so Frances Gunther is asking herself, in the midst of this contest over ideas and jealousies about who's written what, whose ideas are really getting play, Frances Gunther finds herself thinking, well, when is a marriage like an empire? When is my campaign within my marriage like the Indian freedom struggle? And so this, as I said, this boundary between private life and geopolitics just starts to collapse entirely, which is what the book, the sort of leitmotif of the book is.
And Frances has an affair with one of the leaders of the Indian nationalist movement. I thought it was only my generation that had affairs with rebel leaders, but it goes back.
Well, I'm very curious to hear about your generation then. Yes, so Frances Gunther meets Jawaharlal Nehru. So at that point, the head of the Indian National Congress, a really important Indian freedom movement leader, the first prime minister of India, in 1937, when she and John set off on a trip to see Asia for what will be his book, Inside Asia. They're away for 8.5 months. They go everywhere. They start off in Palestine, they go through Egypt, and then, India, Indonesia, on and on and on, China, Japan. And Frances comes across Nehru when he makes his first radio address. It's the first time Nehru is actually ever on the radio, and he's on the radio introducing John Gunther in a lecture. So John Gunther gives a lecture essentially about the rise of fascism. And Nehru points out, well, what about imperialism? What about, you're talking about the have-not countries of, the fascists who are expanding. But what about the have countries that are occupying other people's countries like India? And Frances then becomes very taken with Nehru. And she and Nehru come to she spends at least a couple of days with him traveling through the Northwest Frontier Province when John Gunther goes back to New Delhi. She and Nehru have a very warm and intimate correspondence that lasts for a number of years. Frances is essentially in love with him. Nehru treats her in the way that he treats the whole string of other women who, a lot of historians and the general public have spent a long time wondering about whether he had affairs with them, like Edwina Mountbatten. But they have a long, teasing, affectionate, flirtatious, sometimes actually just overtly sexual correspondence.
Yeah. We come up to HR Knickerbocker, who, as an employee of the Hearst Corporation, I was very fascinated to read about, back then, Uncle Randolph, as we call him, was basically running the Fox News of his era. And Hearst was very sympathetic to Hitler. And here's Knickerbocker out, a guy from Yoakum, Texas, reporting on his behalf. How did Nick navigate this, the rise of fascism he was witnessing, and the fact that his boss was actually sympathetic to it.
Yeah, Knickerbocker is a fascinating character. So, as Chris said, he's born in and raised in Yoakum, Texas. He then goes to work for a number of big city newspapers, including the Newark paper. He goes actually to Germany during the hyperinflationary year of 1923. He's going to train as a psychiatrist. He's done with reporting. And then he walks into the beer hall where Hitler's putsch is underway in 1923, and he goes back into reporting. So he reports, Knickerbocker comes to know Dorothy Thompson when he's her second in command in the Berlin bureau of the Philadelphia paper, but then he goes off to work for Hearst. And Knickerbocker has a really complicated relationship with Hearst because Hearst is at this point making his move really to the right wing. So he's got Mussolini writing the occasional column for syndication for the Hearst papers, Hitler as well. Mussolini predictably writes much more than Hitler. And
Mussolini was a journalist, right? So
exactly, yeah. And this is a theme we should come back to, which is the sort of twinned relationship between the dictator and the journalist. But Knickerbocker becomes incredibly frustrated by Hearst's non-interventionism or isolationism, as he called it, on the eve and then into the beginning of the Second World War. So Knickerbocker ends up leaving the Hearst papers because, as he says, in this war, in Hitler's war more than any others, journalists must take a stand. They must take a stand, and he can't any longer work for Hearst. So, but he's an extraordinarily brave and fearless correspondent.
Well, and his fellow correspondents admired his wife Agnes quite a bit, which complicated things.
Everyone is always making passes. So this is his second wife, Agnes, and everyone is always making passes at Agnes. So yeah, even as Knickerbocker is taking on Goebbels in the front pages of newspapers across the world, that doesn't keep his fellow correspondents from, trying to establish a position with Agnes.
Well, and John Gunther has an affair with Agnes.
That's right. Yeah. And then goes to write about it in a couple of different novels.
And I can sadly report that foreign correspondents are still sleeping with their colleagues' spouses today. It still happens. It becomes a very tight little world. It's like high school. One of the things I noticed is that you give us brief descriptions of their journalism, but their journalism really isn't a big part of the book. Their diaries and their letters play a much greater role. And can you talk about that choice?
So I would say I prioritize the books that they write over their daily articles, because a lot of the stories that they report get you inevitably into the weeds, right? So what you get from the books, so not just Gunther's Inside series, but also Vincent Sheean, Jimmy Sheean, who's one of the other sort of main characters, the main figures in this book. His landmark book is his 1935 personal history. What you get from those is the much more sort of distanced look at how they are understanding the history that they're a part of. And the daily journalism, in some cases, becomes important for the book, like Knickerbocker's showdown with Goebbels about what has happened to the assets that top Nazis, or this is what Knickerbocker alleges, have stowed away abroad. And so then that's the kind of story that is easy to grasp onto. But I read a huge, thousands and thousands and thousands of newspaper stories thinking, how am I going to actually convey this in some way that is going to translate. And so in that sense, the books, become much easier to write about. And as you say, I mean, what I'm trying to give the reader a sense of the relationship between what they are seeing and the ways in which they are processing that in their personal life.
Well, and one of the ways that they process it is not only through, sexual adventures, but also through a lot of drinking. Jimmy Sheean, clearly a genius, but also someone with a persistent drinking problem.
Yeah, I mean, everyone, right?
Yeah, I mean, was this self-medication? Were they treating their PTSD?
Yeah.
No,
I do think I think it is a kind of self-medication. Absolutely. They're tasked with two really important jobs. One of them is the job of witness, and that means seeing horrific things. I mean, horrific things of the kind that, of course, for you, Chris, are, I'm sure, things that you saw entirely too much of, and that reporters today in Ukraine are as well, or all over the world, right, in Syria too. And that that job of witnessing, which so many of today's correspondents have written really lyrically about what that does to a person. But then it's something else too, which is that they feel the need, and I'm curious to know whether you think that this is still a dynamic with, foreign correspondents or war correspondents. They feel a need to actually not just witness, but participate. And that's not just raising the alarm at home, which is trying to get your, the fellow Americans to actually pay attention and sit up and see the, as Jimmy Sheean puts it, the avalanche coming down the hill at you. But also they want to try to influence the course of events in some ways. So there they are, traveling from European chancellery to chancellery, conveying information, carrying information with them. And it's incredibly, I mean, I don't need to tell you, basically the idea that it weighs on your nerves, and you're supposed to be filing stories, every night or every morning about it, sitting there watching coup attempts. I mean, this was a story that I was talking about the difficulty of actually writing from the newspapers, but something like the story of the assassination in the summer of 1934 of the Austrian dictator Dollfuss. Those stories actually just crackle through. And so you could almost use them to convey, I didn't need a more distanced account in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I did a little bit of radio for Voice of America and NPR, and one of the rules was to, sound excited about what you're covering, because by sounding excited about it, you can get your listener excited about it. And I think that's also true with writing. And you're right. When you travel, I spent most of my career in Africa covering places that most Americans can't find on a map, trying to get them to care about it. Or at the very least, writing for the diplomats and the aid workers. I had an ambassador once tell me that he was going to leak me all the information I wanted because his home office took my stories far more seriously than the cables that he wrote himself. And that this became a way of, playing the journalist and, as a diplomatic tool. I would swap information with CIA agents,
Right.
It's the way the game's played. And you begin to feel like you're a part of it and you have a role in it.
Well, I think that you are. I mean, right, in the sense, this is the dilemma that they have, which is when Mussolini wants to talk to you, Mussolini is also using you, right, to get out his version of events. But similarly, when Gandhi wants to talk to you, he's also using you, and figuring out how both to play the game to get what they wanted out of the situation. Out of, say, the big interview, and then somehow to maintain your own sort of moral compass in the middle of it seems, it's a formidable task.
Well, I think it's also hard to maintain your humility, and you have to constantly remind yourself that they're not talking to me because I'm Chris Tomlinson. They were talking to me because I was the Associated Press. They weren't talking to me as an individual. They were talking to my audience through me. and you can't mistake the person for the platform, if you will.
Yeah.
Do
Although,
you think that happened with these folks?
well, in some ways they were their platform, right? I mean, when Dorothy Thompson or say H.R. Knickerbocker gets an interview with Hitler, it's not unlike Anderson Cooper sort of running over and interviewing Putin. I mean, they are a kind of brand franchise. So they're in the newsreels, they're on the front pages. Of course, the scale of readership far dwarfs, what newspapers have today. They're on the radio. And so in a sense, I don't think actually humility didn't really come into effect. I mean, it's really, there's a sense of grandeur and even grandiosity about them. So, and some of that is that, they're hugely important. People are listening to them. But as the American ambassador to Italy says to Vincent Sheean, you and Dorothy Thompson, this is after the Second World War, you and Dorothy Thompson need to stop playing God. You need to stop thinking that you can bring peace to the world. And Sheehan says, well, why? Why should we stop? If we can bring peace to the world, why should we stop? And indeed, it's a good question. A friend of mine recently said something about Sheehan that I think is so right on, which is he was a man with a kind of porosity to the world. Like he more than all the rest of them. I mean, this is true of Dorothy Thompson as well, but he metabolizes the world's sufferings. And something like that, of course, does drive you to drink. And more than that, and this is back to this question of, are they eyewitnesses or are they intervening? Sheehan actually begins to feel that he's got a second sense for the world's ills, that he's like literally a tuning fork for the universe's troubles. And that means that he thinks, on the eve of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, he thinks he's predicting it. He knows what's going to happen. He has a nervous breakdown. In late 1947, he says to Dorothy Thompson, Gandhi will be assassinated and by a Hindu. And then he races off to India and is there, literally, in the courtyard of Birla House when Gandhi is assassinated. And he has the sense of just, if I knew this, how could I not prevent it? And I mean, I can't even begin to imagine that is a kind of emotional burden on a person. So that's what the book is about, right? The book is about, it's less about the sort of daily stories, because frankly, a lot of people are not going to be interested in, as I said, the Ruhr crisis or whatever. It's, it's kind of textbooky stuff, but it's about how is it that it was possible to live and do this job and interpret, and then fundamentally also change, and this is part of the argument of the book, what it became acceptable to talk about. So part of what I'm saying is that they open up new frontiers in the ways in which we're thinking people could think about death. So Gunther's Death Me Not Proud was thought to be just a shocking book at the time. Now, of course, death memoirs are, a dime a dozen. Or Jimmy Sheehan wrote about the marriage of Sinclair Lewis and Dorothy Thompson in what was viewed as a totally taboo-breaking book about their marriage of his friends, a book called Dorothy in Red, published in 1963. And I think that the reason why they could write those stories is precisely because they had this firsthand experience of fascism in the 1930s.
Well, and it's, I think it's, I guess I was very taken by seeing people like I felt like I've known in war zones or in foreign reporting capitals. The philandering, the drinking, the secret lesbian or gay affairs that people are having. It just struck me as extraordinarily modern. The number of abortions that these women,
yes.
that a lot of these women have.
Yes. No, I know. And today, especially, of course, this is.
I mean, so they seem like very modern people, but sadly, it also seems like a very modern issue, right? I mean, when I read about their observations of the rise of fascism, I, can't help but feel like we're going through something similar today. you know, what you said, you know, people, my friends and my wife joke with me, but it's, you know, after 30 years as a professional observer of watching human nature and of watching how people interact and how governments and militaries and things happen, you know, um, you do get a weariness that when you recognize that pattern and you're going, oh my God, this is what's going to happen in the next 6 months because I've seen this happen in 3 other countries and the people were behaving exactly the same way. And it's going to be a horrible tragedy. And nothing I write or say or do is going to stop that train from leaving the station. And I think that's one of the hardest things for journalists to cope with. And it seems that's what we were coping with here.
That's exactly, I think that's so beautifully put. It's a feeling literally of impotence, right? I mean, there you are, you know what's going to, you can both see the future. So this group of reporters, they're always saying to each other, you know, are you an end of 36er, meaning that's when you think the Second World War is going to break out, or are you a beginning of 38er? They know it's coming. It's just a question of when. But then you can see it and you feel the need to warn. And as Dorothy Thompson says, her vision of this years is that people are grabbing at her, you know, that she has nightmares of people like grabbing at her because she feels that it's her moral duty. And there's a way in which, that the kind of psychic toll that takes. And they are modern people. I mean, they're the people who are young in the first modern sexual revolution of the 1920s. There are many, many abortions because you have sexual liberties that coincide with kind of crummy means of birth control or sometimes no birth control. The women get pregnant and, you know, pay extremely high costs for all of that, the men as well. But, and I think, I guess what I would say about this story is that it brings together so many elements that we oftentimes kind of tend to view separately. One of them is the kind of this first modern sexual revolution of the 1920s and 30s, the sort of psychoanalysis, the geopolitics, the rise of the dictators, the rise of anti-colonial nationalism, the Indian freedom struggle, and then also the rise of memoir culture. And those things are all happening at the same time, but we don't really think about them as existing in the same frame. And that's what this group of journalists do for us. I think they make it possible to see the interrelationships between those things that we oftentimes consider separately.
So I'm gonna give a one question warning to Rebecca to have those audience questions ready. And I'm going to ask my last question of you, Deborah, which is foreign correspondents are often criticized for bringing a colonial or a neo-colonial perspective to their reporting, to their attitude toward the local people and the local governments. You know, we're sometimes not as respectful as we should be. How do these folks stand up to that kind of criticism?
It's a really interesting question because in a sense, because they were Americans, they tended to take the part of freedom struggles, so anti-colonial freedom struggles. Because they're a particular kind of American, then that's true, especially of Sheean, who is very close to Nehru as well, and to Gandhi, and writes about them both. And
Francis and Jimmy were also very pro-Palestinian.
Right, exactly. So, Frances Wright is extremely pro. You know, she becomes the American exponent of the Indian freedom struggle for a certain period of time, especially during the Second World War. She then also becomes a Zionist, which is a strange combination to have in a single person. There aren't that many people who are pro-Indian freedom struggle and also pro-Zionism during the Second World War, but she's absolutely in that Venn diagram. So there's, yes, I mean, many of the charges that are leveled against contemporary foreign correspondence now, which is using fixers, using local intermediaries, not understanding as much about the history. You could, go through the book and you can certainly point at instances where these people are guilty of those sins. But it's also worth saying that they see the development of the rise of anti-colonial nationalism and the end of the European empires. And this is a development that they view as long overdue by the time it happens.
Well, I couldn't help but when I was reading Francis's criticism of the British Empire, I was just thinking about the slew of books coming out right now about, the evils of the British Empire and how did they get a pass.
Oh, yes. No, Frances would not be one bit surprised by almost anything that was said. I mean, in her 1944 Revolution in India, she essentially lays out many of the charges that are now leveled against the British Empire and more. And she does so in a very epigrammatic, very, very funny and devastating way. So, yeah,
all right,
as you say,
let's get some questions from viewers. Rebecca, are you there?
I am here. Hello. Thank you both for this really wonderful conversation that you've been having. Thank you for participating tonight. And we have one question from the audience, and this is for Deborah. Did any of these authors have the effect they intended in staving off or preventing or remediating the harms that they saw on the horizon? It's from Tracy Roberts.
Yeah, this is a really good question. In some ways, it's hard to answer because the degree to which, I mean, they command really vast audiences. So they have millions and millions of American readers. And so the question is, to what extent did their work acclimate Americans to the idea that they will not be able to stay out of the European conflict? And, raising support. It's thought that Dorothy Thompson, for instance, does a great deal to urge Americans. She urges Americans to support the British, to support the Lend-Lease effort. She's, essentially speaking to audiences both through her newspaper columns and through the radio, and then even in person through huge public meetings of thousands, about the need to actually support the British cause. So Churchill calls her, she was worth an entire regiment in the cause of human liberty. So in that sense, yes, they did absolutely have the influence and effect that they intended. On the other hand, could they stop the rise of fascism? No. They raised awareness actually about attacks against Jews. Something that we forget happened in American papers in 1933 and 1934. They're absolutely reporting about the atrocities against Jews. So, and I think, more broadly, in terms of in large cultural influence, I think that they really changed this group of people, changed what we think it was legitimate to write and to talk about. So John Gunther's Death Be Not Proud is followed by many other people who feel that now death is something, an illness is something that is for conversation. And similarly for Sheean's, a book about marriage, divorce, homosexuality, alcoholism, all the things that figure in Dorothy and Red.
Thank you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you didn't have if you don't have a question ready, just I have a couple more. So, but
okay,
go ahead.
We do have one for you, Chris.
Oh, okay.
Do you have any examples of instances in which your current fellow journalists have foreseen the situation in Ukraine with the rise of authoritarianism or Christian nationalism in the U.S. and raised concerns sufficiently to stave off what they may see on the horizon now? That's also Tracy.
I've been writing about Putin and the danger he poses to the world for 6 years. Masha Geeson at the New Yorker has been writing about it for since Putin came to power. I think there is a problem that too many editors are only worried about doing a story once an overt act has happened. They're not really interested in that analysis predicting the future. We call those thumbsuckers in the business. And to have your editor call your story a thumbsucker is an insult, and it's you're being told to go back and do it again. And I think this is a problem with journalism today, is that we have a very I think we've been boxed too much. I think Deborah makes the point in the book that what passed as new journalism in the 60s, these folks were doing in the 20s. I used to, when I reported from Rwanda as an AP and Voice of America stringers, getting paid 10 cents a word and $50 a radio piece, I could get away with a lot more talking about Central Africa than I could writing about politics in Texas, just because people were not trying to box me up. They were giving me more space to be more explanatory. But no, there have been the voices have been out there for a while. I constantly get slammed for my criticism of Putin and Xi Jinping, who I think is even more dangerous than Vladimir Putin. But I get called a warmonger for that. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that I think that because of the work that, the groundwork that has been prepared, that very few people fell for the argument that it was Ukraine that was threatening Russia, right? I mean, the kind of nonsense that you could get away with, on the EU and with Czechoslovakia or Poland threatening Germany, and people just didn't believe it here, and I think some of that is due to the serious groundwork that was laid, by our reporters and foreign correspondents. So.
Oh, and by the way, tip of the hat to Cheryl, who's staying up until 1 a.m. in London to join us.
Oh, nice. Oh, and Deborah, what are some of the other journalists that you include in this book that we haven't talked about, or on the flip side of that, what are some of the journalists you wish you could have included?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh,
it's from Michael Fisher.
Yeah, thanks so much. So one of the so there's a kind of inner circle, which is Knickerbocker, Sheean, Gunther, Thompson, and Francis Gunther. And then there's an outer circle, which includes Bill Shire, who's probably the best known of the foreign correspondents now, of this set. He was a little bit younger than the rest of them. A marvelous woman named Emily Hahn, who was a reporter for The New Yorker for many, many decades and wrote a ton of books. And she reports both from China, and then she's also reporting from the Africa, from Congo. So you will meet a whole host of extraordinary figures of their moment. Edgar Maurer, Chicago Daily News. It sounds like I'm torturing my cat, but I'm not. She's just somehow has found her way up here, so please ignore her. I'm not stepping on her or anything. I'm not quite sure. It's one of those inconveniences of Zoom.
So, go ahead, Chris. So you said you had some other questions.
No, I was just going to ask Deborah, when I was reading the book, I swear I saw some of these writers' vocabulary and writing style seep into your writing. There were moments I was like, she's writing like someone from the 20s or the 30s, and I love it.
Yeah.
Was that on purpose, or did that just?
Oh, that was totally intentional. I mean, so what I wanted to do was to start off in that kind of brash 1920s gangster-ish, there you are in the middle, not to overdo it. And here my editor, Marie Pantogen, was really great at saying, oops, that's too much. We've just crossed a line here. We need to pare this down. But to start in that and this is so important in terms of hearing their voices, right? Because that's the way that people talked. And to hear their argot and to know how they gossip and to know how they talk. And then, of course, you end up in the really sobered up period of the 1970s in the epilogue. Everyone, all the tragedies kind of fully blown by then, of course. And then the style is very different. But yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. And of course, they're brilliant writers. I mean, they're fantastic describers of things. And the material is amazing. So, just like, what is it like to sit down with Hitler? What does it feel like with Mussolini? So I may actually go and eject my cat. I know that we just have a couple more minutes, but I think everyone will be much happier if she's actually out of this room. I will be right back.
Sure. So, Chris, while Deborah is taking care of her kitty cat, Tracy Roberts also writes, for both of you, but for Chris, are there others whom we should be paying attention to today? Tracy Roberts mentions Masha Gessen and Timothy Schneider and you. Are there some other foreign correspondents you think we should be paying attention to?
I think it's, I would say I would actually choose news organizations to watch, because we're all a little more sophisticated now, right? I mean, at the AP, when I went in, my first bit during the invasion of Iraq, I was there for 8 months continuously. But then after that, it was 8-week rotations, right? So I would just say keep on the New Yorker, keep on the Washington Post, the Times, the Guardian. No serious news organization keeps people too long in those circumstances, because it's just, you will begin to lose perspective if you stay too long, especially when you have to file every day, and and in some cases you're getting shot at every day, and there's just, if you're only sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, you're only good for a couple of months.
Right. Wow. And for Deborah, through producing this book, did your research lead you into any new directions, things where you might go from here, things that you were inspired to take on next?
I think that the research has maybe spoiled me permanently in terms of the sorts of, the high demands of a topic, because these were such fascinating people. I mean, I spent 8 years working on the book, and in part, I think that was because I really didn't want to let them go. I mean, I didn't want to be finished with them. So I am interested in the dynamics of groups, and that might justice and attempts to create justice after the Second World War. But I don't know. I mean, I'm in that phase of post-book where, either I'm sort of passing through topics quickly. Chris, I'm sure, knows this very well.
You're still in book promotion phase. It's too early to start working on the next book.
Yeah.
And Tracy Roberts asks, how on earth did Thompson work her way to the position she had? And she says, is it pure chutzpah, or why is she so little known today?
Oh, it's such a good question. Chris was asking some version of this question too that I didn't answer, which is, so Thompson, one of the curious things is that women in the 20s and the 30s do regularly become well-known correspondents. So there are other people, when we were talking about journalists, I wish I could have included Anne O'Hare McCormick, very little written about today, who worked for the New York Times. Sigrid Schultz, whom the historian David Milne is now writing a book about. there are a number, the famous ones, Martha Gellhorn, as I said, Emily Hahn, who works for the New Yorker. So it's less unusual than you would think, because this is a kind of foundational moment for foreign correspondence where the field itself is expanding. And then you have a whole host of women who are college educated. So, women make up nearly half of university students in America, in the United States in the early 20s. And so a new field, languages are really important, which a number of these women have. Dorothy Thompson's German is, good, but actually always very strongly accented, apparently. So she has incredible resolve. She's a minister's daughter. She really brings the sort of fervor of the pulpit to her work, I would say. But there are more opportunities than you would assume. And there are probably more opportunities in truth for women in the 1920s than there are in the 1950s in terms of foreign correspondence. By the 1950s, foreign correspondence is very much more institutionalized. You can't just go where you want. As for why Dorothy Thompson isn't well known today, I do think that there's a style that she has, which is this highly emotional style that is totally characteristic for the 1930s, in which she, in a sense, pioneers in those op-ed columns. And then by the buttoned up, more rational 1950s, starts to look just over the top, and she takes a bunch of unpopular positions. She's very pro-Palestinian, for instance. She's very anti-communist, as Chris says. And so her politics look out of step with mainstream American public opinion. And she begins to lose her columns, her purchase, on American public life. I also think it's very difficult to stay as a cultural arbiter for much more, than a decade or two. It's because ultimately they're associated with the disaster of the 30s and the war. And then, their moment is done. And Jimmy Sheean sees that after the war. He says, we're finished. And John Gunther says, well, no, I'm not finished. Maybe you're finished, but I'm not finished.
Well, that's all of our audience questions. So anybody, here's your last chance. Anyone other final questions that anybody wants to ask Chris? Deborah, any final statement you'd like to share with us before we say goodbye?
Just to say really what an honor it's been to have Chris as the interlocutor. So Thank you. Seriously, thank you, because
I wish I could write this well. I really do. I can't write this well, folks. You need to buy this book.
As I said, they are themselves amazing writers. A, you can write this well. B, they're amazing writers. And it is, I hope that that people take up their work and, find it engaging, because as Chris says, so much of what they say feels eerily predictive at the moment. And putting together the story in the way that our correspondents, our journalists are now, and connecting the dots, kind of thinking about what the Russian invasion and, of Crimea has to do with Syria, has to do with the situation that Ukraine is in now, is hugely important. And of course, that's what they're doing through the 20s and 30s. So, yeah, thanks so much to you all for coming. And thank you again.
Yes, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Deborah, for sharing. Thank you for your book. Thank you, Chris, for sharing tonight and all your thoughts. And thank you all, everybody, for joining us. And if you did join us late, this is being recorded. You can watch this again, or if you missed something from the beginning, the same link that you used to come to this program, you can use it again tomorrow, and you can still participate in the chat. All the Mark Twain House virtual programs are posted on our website after the fact, and they're available to watch whenever you'd like. And you can also check out the events on our website at marktwainhouse.org/events. If you want to plan a visit to the Mark Twain House, you can hit marktwainhouse.org/visit and find out more about that. And see what else is upcoming and going on here at the Mark Twain House and Museum. So thank you to our guests. We're just so grateful for your time tonight, and thank you for joining us.
All right, y'all have a great night.
Thanks again. Bye-bye. Thanks again.